Welcome to the second annual Juneteenth celebration hosted by the Racial Justice Collaborative. We are going to be discussing some key moments in history relating to the story of the African American people and our history in the United States of America. We're going to be discussing these key moments that begin in the late 1910s and move onwards into the 1920s. The Red Summer of 1919 is an important event in history where, right after the end of the First World War, you have Black servicemen that fought in the European theater returning to the homes that they had left in the United States of America and the social positions that they had also left in the United States of America, and having tasted degrees of equal treatment on the theater of war over there. Once they returned here, there was a great degree of contention and incident that was caused throughout a large number of cities in the United States. For historical context, the First World War, the war to end all wars, is named because it was a massive war, the most massive war in its time yet as of that day. It was a war between the Entente powers, the United Kingdom, France, the Republic of France, and the Empire of Russia against the Central Powers, the German Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman empires. Later, other powers such as Japan, and of course, because of the history we're going to be talking about today, the United States were drawn into the conflict on the side of the Entente powers. Black servicemen obviously went alongside white servicemen on the behalf of the United States heading to the European theater. In the First World War, there were originally 20,000 African American volunteers out of the 100,000 American volunteers in general. This was not enough soldiers, and so this was the situation in which the congressional bill creating the first formal and remaining draft that continues to this day rather than being for a specific conflict. This was the first time this was brought in, and after that was ushered in, there were over 700,000 Black soldiers serving in the armed forces. Black enlisted men were barred from serving in the Marines, were only allowed to do menial tasks in the Navy, but were allowed to fill every role in the Army, including combat roles, except for aviation units. The Air Force did not yet exist at this time, and this even did include officer positions for the segregated Army, since Black soldiers and white soldiers could not serve in the same units due to the laws of segregation in the United States, and therefore this even required Black officers. And so some 600 Black officers were trained and given the ranks of lieutenant or captain, and were allowed to oversee these units. The Red Summer of 1919 was named this because when these African American soldiers returned from the European theater and came back to the homes that they had left behind, the white society that they had left behind in America, with their very specific roles that had been cut out for them before, were concerned that once they returned, they would be uppity, they would be egotistical or prideful, however they would think to call it, and therefore unwilling to return to the servile and secondhand conditions that they had left from, many of which simply slavery adjacent. And therefore, there was a great deal of pent-up aggression on the part of whites in these cities where a large number of Black veterans were returning to. In addition to this, there was also this degree of camaraderie and respect that these Black veterans had received serving overseas in the European theater, and thus there was a degree of contention on the behalf of these Black veterans, which now had tastes of this respect, and even less so than they were due, but more so than they received before. And there was a great deal of strife over how this would be treated when these two forces returned and collided in the summer of 1919, which would erupt out into violent altercations and bloody attacks all throughout the country, and would go on for years after. There are a great number of violent and lethally destructive riots throughout the United States in cities all across the country, starting in the summer of 1919. But they generally fall into two sort of scales of outcome. There were incidents that simply resulted in massacre. This was often a result of unprepared nature or lack of weapons on the behalf of the African American communities in those circumstances, and also circumstances of violent and courageous resistance on the behalf of other African American communities that were targeted in the exact same way as others. However, with weapons and with training, much of which coming from these very same African American veterans returning from the First World War, they were able to fight back and defend the homes of those who were so violently under attack. Perhaps one of the most famous by name, and due perhaps partially because of the centennial anniversary of the event, is the 1921 Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre, in which hundreds of African Americans were killed and thousands were left homeless, as entire swaths of the African American neighborhood of Tulsa were left completely destroyed in the wake of white riots and destructive forces moving through and razing neighborhoods down to the ground, brick by brick, board by board. There are many massacres like this throughout the United States, such as the Massacre of Rosewood, Florida, where this predominantly African American town was destroyed, much in the same way as Tulsa, and its citizens were driven out into the swamps, where they were hunted like animals by these rioting and destructive mobs and Klansmen, all such thing, right alongside police forces. You know, the citizen vigilante rioter alongside the official law enforcement officer, doing the same job and with the same goal and intention in their heart. And the Elaine, Arkansas massacre, which was incited by Black sharecroppers deciding to unionize in order to escape the slavery adjacent conditions of that entire system, which was resulted in the slaughter and destruction of all the farmers and their families that dared to scheme to make money. We also have the specific stories of resistance in this particular event. The Chicago race riot of 1919 started when, at a segregated beach in Lake Michigan, a Black beachgoer drifted too close to the white section. His presence, of course, deemed insulting, worthy of violence. This teenager on a pool toy just drifting in the lake was struck by rocks by the white beachgoers, knocked unconscious, and killed as he fell into the lake and drowned. There were eyewitnesses to the violence attack, and of course, the police, which eventually arrived, arrested none of the white citizens in question. And this immediately broke out into violent altercation, with black beachgoers with weapons breaking out and coming into violent conflict with white beachgoers. And this violent conflict would spread throughout all of Chicago as it left this initial incident at the beach. And this would result in massive roving mobs of white citizens coming together in order to stamp out and burn out this black menace and clean it up, as they would often say. In this regard, the black population of Chicago, however, was unwilling to be moved aside. And with weapons and with training from the Black World War I veterans that returned to cities much like Chicago, they were able to fight back and fight back hard, driving many of these mobs from black neighborhoods. And of course, there were many black lives taken, but in this violent conflict, this example of a miniature war, it was not one-sided. Washington, D.C., an incredibly similar story, where initially it began with a black woman who was assailed by who she described to be a black robber, which received no media attention, of course. And then later that month, a white woman robbed also by a black man, which prompted a 100 police officer response, as well as a 1,000 volunteer militia response of white citizens pouring out into the Washington, D.C. area. In addition to it being in response to these robberies and the hunting of this Negro fiend that had perpetrated them, according to the newspapers, the exact phrasing being just that, there was also, due to this being in the age of Prohibition, a number of underground, bootleggers networks that were primarily managed and controlled by black families in the Washington, D.C. area. And so many of these white mobs, in addition to hunting for the Negro fiend robber, also just brazenly broke into black homes in order to steal possessions, including the much coveted liquor that was traded in Washington, D.C. However, the black veterans, which brought military training, expertise, and weapons handling, were able to help other members of the black community fight back, and the bootlegger community, which had experience with smuggling of illicit materials, were able to bring weapons into Washington, D.C. in order to arm the black population when the government shut down the sale of firearms in the Washington, D.C. area once it was found that they were primarily being bought by black citizens. Because apparently, even back then, it could be done that fast when guns were in the hands of the black population. But fortunately, due to the resources and the ingenuity of the community, they were able to still get the tools necessary to fight back against this brazen and violent oppression. And it was not only limited to this 1,000-man mob or 1,000-man posse, whichever you would want to describe it. It was also corrupt police officers, which would brazenly break into black homes without warrants and were defended with lethal force, with many of these officers being killed when they simply broke into black homes, as well as even military forces, which were called in to defend Washington, D.C., with cavalry and Marines even being taken on by armed black citizens defending their neighborhoods. And the result of these violent altercations that ravaged the entirety of the country. But in these most fascinating of cases, they were not one-sided, far from it. And in this particular case, in the Washington, D.C. race riot, there was actually a higher total of white fatalities and injuries even than black, showing a tremendous camaraderie and tremendous courage in the face of overwhelming odds and fighting back against those that would destroy homes and businesses on a mere whim. We stand here at the Centennial commemorating events of the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre in 1921. Like so many of these towns, like all of these towns that we had described, it was a thriving Black-owned business that was brought up from scratch by those who had even less than scratch to build it. And it was a great achievement by those who were simply attempting to build a life and prosperity for themselves, something every citizen should be able to have and should be able to have without needing to fight for it, needing to be able to fight for every inch of it. And like so many other circumstances like that, it was taken so violently from the people that lived there and had built it. It's important to remember.